Hello everyone, welcome to Sunya IAS and welcome to this lecture. Today we are going to talk about a very crucial and a very disturbing topic, which is extrajudicial killings. Now, why did I say that it is a disturbing topic? See, you need to understand that India is a democratic country, right? And in a democratic country, we function by rule of law. When you study in M. Lakshmikant about the features of Indian democracy, about the features of Indian constitution, you study over there that rule of law is one of the features. Now, what is rule of law? It is better that you understand rule of law in comparison to rule of men, right? Just think about the ancient times when there used to be one king and he used to decide what the rules are going to be. He used to decide how people are going to be punished and all. So that was rule of men. As compared to that, now there is rule of law, which means that there is an organ called judiciary, which is supposed to assess whether you committed a crime or not, and then you will be subject to that particular punishment, right? That is rule of law. The topic for today is extrajudicial killings, and the name itself will tell you that these are extrajudicial in the sense that they are beyond what judiciary has told us to do. It is judiciary's job to tell us who is the criminal, who is not, and only after the judiciary will pronounce that verdict can we actually punish that person. But there is this term which is very famous, which is called encounter. Encounter is a layman term, right? When you use the term encounter, you are talking in a layperson's language, but the technical definition, the technical term for this name is extrajudicial killings, wherein the judiciary has not given a verdict, but still the police, and who is the police? Police is the executive, right? So the executive ends up punishing that particular organ, that particular criminal, without being assessed that whether this person has committed the crime or not, which we commonly call as encounter, right? Now, if we talk about context, we have a developing culture which is being termed as the Singham culture. What is Singham culture? This is inspired by a lot of Bollywood movies wherein it is considered legitimate and it is considered in fact good that because our judiciary is so slow, because right now in our judiciary there are about 5 crore pending cases, and there is this very famous saying कि कोर्ट कचहरी के चक्कर में नहीं पड़ना चाहिए, है ना, in India. So because all of that is a reality in our country, this somehow empowers the police to engage in extrajudicial killings without any order to shoot the person who is just an accused. The person who is just an accused, not a convict. Even if a person was a convict, there is no right to the police to actually shoot them, right? But shooting an accused is anyway very problematic. So there are multiple cases. There was one case wherein there was the gang rape case of a veterinarian doctor. The gang rape case of veterinarian doctor wherein there were 4 suspects, and apparently they were running away and the police shot them and they were killed. And there was a massive uproar, massive support for the police personnel that instant justice was delivered, instant justice was done, etc. That was there. Then there is this episode of a gangster, Vikas Dubey, who was killed in UP, right? And he was blatantly during the daylight, he was chased down by police cars and he was murdered. He was encountered, and we call it a murder because it was not a result of judicial decision, but it was a decision of the executive to do this. So this encounter culture, this becomes problematic because today you are seeing the encounter of one suspect. Tomorrow, that suspect could be someone around you as well. If the need for proving the crime goes away, then executive gets a lot of power in their hand, and that power is not done. That power is not provided to them by the Indian Constitution itself. So, a few pointers before we go forward. One is regarding the notes. I would suggest that either you can go for the Sunya books, wherein in the GS2 book you will be getting this particular topic, or if you don't have that book and you're not planning to order it also, you can make handwritten notes from the class that is going to go forward. That is one. Second is, as I told you, this topic is important in GS2. Now in GS2, this can be a separate question as well. Please be very clear about it that extrajudicial killings is such a topic which can be asked in a separate question as well. So it can be asked in a 10 marker, even in a 15 marker. Extrajudicial killings and its impact on democracy, it can be asked, right? So there can be a separate question, and when you get a question on rule of law, you are supposed to write extrajudicial killings as one of the challenges. Fine. Even in your prelims examination, the meaning of extrajudicial killings can be asked somehow. Extrajudicial killings can be one of the options as a challenge to the rule of law and things. And even it is also a challenge, for that matter, to separation of powers. Separation of powers. Because it is not in the executive's power to actually punish without the judicial decision. So, separation of powers. If the executive is taking that power in its hand, it is actually violating separation of powers doctrine. Now, if you were to write the definition, I will dictate the definition and write a few keywords. You can actually write that. So, extrajudicial killings, also known as encounters. Extrajudicial killings, also known as encounters, is the killing of individuals by law enforcement officers. Is the killing of individuals by law enforcement officers without following the due process of law. Without following the due process of law, that is a just judicial trial. When somebody accuses you of committing a particular crime and you are supposed to prove yourself as innocent, then there needs to be a trial against you. And if there is no trial against you, the due process of law, that is a just judicial trial, is being compromised with. And that can lead to an extrajudicial killing, and that will lead to ultimately your violation of fundamental rights. So when you write a description, an introduction, which is this comprehensive, you tend to gain half a mark extra, because it is clear to the examiner that you have made some kind of effort to create a well-rounded definition. Okay. Now let's talk about the statistics. And this is very important because the extrajudicial killings have been rising. Even for that matter, Supreme Court has also spoken against these extrajudicial killings and the encounter culture. But again, I told you about the Singham culture also, that it is somehow considered legitimate now because of the popular appeal, that now you would be allowed, the police officers are allowed and in fact encouraged to engage in extrajudicial killings. So, if we talk about the number of cases, from 2018, from 2016, sorry, 2016 to 2022, from 2016 to 2022, there were 813 cases of extrajudicial killings. That means 813 people were killed without any substantive proof against them, and they were killed during the process of investigation, during the process of interrogation and whatnot, right? So they were killed by the executive branch, not by the due process of law. And here I would also like to make a distinction over here. See, there are two terminologies and you need to be clear about their distinction. One is extrajudicial killings, right? One is custodial death. Custodial death. Now, extrajudicial killings is equal to the encounters, right? This can be, technically, extrajudicial killings are only allowed in self-defense. If a criminal is trying to attack the police officers and the police officer uses the gun for that matter, so in that way, self-defense can allow encounters. But mostly encounters are done in a deliberate manner. Encounters are done in a deliberate manner to fasten the process of so-called justice delivery. Custodial death is a different concept. Custodial death is not encounter necessarily, right? Custodial death is when an accused or a convict is in custody of the police and loses his or her life during that custody. Fine. So, loses life in custody. Fine. Now, this loss of life can be because of various reasons. And a lot of custodial deaths also show that the conditions inside the jails are not reformative. Prisons in India are supposed to be reformative, but number of custodial deaths that are increasing show that our prisons are not really performing the reformative role, right? So, for example, in the Nirbhaya case, Nirbhaya rape case, those were not accused, they were convicts, right? But one of them committed suicide. Because he committed suicide in the premises of the jail, it becomes a custodial death because he was in the custody of the police. Another case of custodial death happened in Tamil Nadu during the COVID-19 pandemic. This was Jairaj and Phoenix or Benix. They were father-son duo who used to work in a mobile repair shop, and they apparently opened their shop for a longer time than the COVID lockdown had mandated, and the police brought them into the jail, and within a few days they died. And it was not clear how, although it was very clear that they were tortured, etc. So, custodial death is not encounter. Fine, encounter is different. Extrajudicial killing or encounter is different. Custodial death is different. I hope you understand the difference, right? Now, so custodial, the extrajudicial killings since 2016 to 2022, there have been 813 cases, right? Then when we talk about state-wise analysis, there are two states which always come on top when it comes to extrajudicial killings. The highest one, Chhattisgarh. The highest one is in Chhattisgarh. And this is followed by Uttar Pradesh. Fine. So छत्तीसगढ़ में सबसे ज्यादा लोगों को एनकाउंटर के थ्रू मारा जाता है, एंड अ बिग रीजन फॉर दैट इज द Maoist movement or the Naxalwadi movement. Naxalwadi movement. But the problem here is that many cases are such जो कि नक्सलवाद के नाम पे they just make an excuse of Naxalism, but they're actually not Naxalites, and sometimes there is personal enmity of the police officers, sometimes there's some other reason, but they're not Naxalites and they're killed in the name of Naxalites. So that is a problem. Then overall, we have seen a decline in the registration of extrajudicial killing cases. So there is a 15% decline in the registration of these cases from 2016 to 2022. It is not that these killings are not happening. It is that they are happening and a case is not registered against that particular officer who is actually engaging in these killings, and that is more problematic because this basically means that it is being normalized, right? These extrajudicial killings, they are being normalized and they are not even being reported. So that is a problem, right? Then when we talk about the role of NHRC, and this information you can use in a question of NHRC also, from 2016 to 2022, it has only been one case where NHRC has recommended prosecution of this officer who engaged in extrajudicial killings. So from 2016 to 2022, only one case wherein NHRC has recommended the trial of this particular officer who engaged in extrajudicial killings. So this is highly problematic, right? This is highly problematic. Now these are some of the cases, and all of these cases, if you look at the names, they are cases of extrajudicial killings itself, right? These are cases of extrajudicial killings itself, and basically in some of these cases, Supreme Court has come out with some really good terminologies which you can use to define and describe extrajudicial killings. So for example, in Om Prakash case was in 2012. So please note this down. In Om Prakash case, Supreme Court called these extrajudicial killings as state sponsored terrorism, right? Supreme Court called these killings as state sponsored terrorism. It's a big thing to say, but Supreme Court made that comment of extrajudicial killings being state sponsored terrorism. Then there was another case in 2010. Here also Supreme Court made a pertinent remark that fair investigation is a fundamental right. Fair investigation is a fundamental right. That means you cannot violate the right to be fairly investigated if you are accused of a crime, and you definitely cannot be killed without the due process of law having been followed, right? Then one thing which I would not recommend writing, but I would just tell you to show you the severity of the issue, that is the extrajudicial killings. One thing in Prakash Kadam case which was said was that the police officers who engage in extrajudicial killings should be facing death penalty. Now this is not something which I will recommend that you write in your answer sheet, because this is a very extreme view. You are not supposed to write such extreme views in your answers. But yes, this was said in the court of law in Prakash Kadam case, that the police officers who engage in these extrajudicial killings should be facing death penalty, right? Now one by one we will note down and we will study why extrajudicial killings happen, apart from the obvious reasons And this is what distinguishes a layperson from someone who's preparing for UPSCs, because we have organized these particular reasons into subheadings, headings and subheadings. So, one reason is the nature of police in India, right? Police does not have any accountability, and police also faces a lot of protection and privilege, right? You would not be seeing cases of police officers who have made encounters and are facing jail term for that, although this is something that is unconstitutional. In fact, many police officers, they are lauded for being called the encounter specialist, right? Many police officers are lauded and they enjoy the tag of being the encounter specialist, right? But this, in a country which follows rule of law, is not done, right? Then there are also lack of resources overall. If you talk about resources to properly transport the accused, we will see that the jeeps that the police officers are having, the security apparatus that police officers are having, they are not very adequate, right? And sometimes the accused actually end up running, and then the gun has to be used, and that is because there is lack of resources overall. Fine. And of course, there is political pressure. Like in the Hyderabad veterinarian case, there was high political pressure. And even in the Vikas Dubey case, there was high political pressure to actually nab these people who were either accused or convicted. But even if they are convicted, the executive arm is not supposed to execute the punishment. Fine, it has to be given by the judiciary first, and then it has to be taken up by the prison. Then, what is the other reason? The maintenance of law and order. If we have what we call as miscreants, then we see that these it becomes difficult for the law enforcement agencies, and holding up the gun and using it becomes easier to maintain law and order, although it is not that the police officers can use however many bullets and however many times the gun is possible, because they have to give account of each bullet that they have used, right? This is the reality, but that is there. This is a legitimate reason: retaliation and protection of one's own self. And this is the reason because of which even intended encounters end up being forgiven, because they are seen as retaliation. This is one of the biggest reasons there is lack of trust in judiciary. There are about 4.8 crore cases, which comes to about 5 crore only, which are pending right now, and 30 lakh cases are in the Supreme Court, right? Which is not acceptable. And overall, the threat of terrorism. So if you will see, there were extrajudicial killings in Mon, Nagaland. These are called the Mon killings. Okay. And here AFSPA was in application, Armed Forces Special Powers Act. Under AFSPA, any kind of retaliatory firing, any kind of protective firing, any kind of firing done by the armed forces to protect themselves, they will not be punished. And thus, there were civilians who were killed by the armed forces, and the armed forces have accepted that they were civilians which were actually killed in 2021. They were just going around and they thought that they were terrorists, thought that they were insurgents, but they were actually civilians. And that is what happens when you legitimize the extrajudicial killings. These are Mon killings, right? So they are also an example of extrajudicial killings. Fine. Then caste based violence. Now overall, because casteism is so deep rooted, you just write one pointer that deep rooted casteism and the bias of police also ends up them using the extrajudicial route, the encounter route. Fine. There is lack of legal recourse and the culture of impunity. That is why, if there is caste based discrimination, then the barrel of the gun is supported more than the rule of law. Then political unrest, political pressure, there is weak legal system and overall failure of democracy. So you just write it in one point. So all these points you write as 1 point each, and I'm just trying to explain you the various dimensions. When we talk about economic factors, the people mostly who are killed are poor people, like the Mon killings. They were civilians who were poor in nature, and therefore they cannot fight against the system. When you can't fight against the system, you just go scot free, right? There is corruption, there is ineffective legal system. So these are similar points. Don't write them again and again. And vigilantism, this is an emerging reason. Like I told you, this is similar to the Singham syndrome, wherein the police officers have celebrity syndrome. People have celebrity syndrome. And lack of human rights protection, there is weak legal framework, inadequate investigation and limited oversight. Fine. So they are all interrelated factors, they affect each other, and all of them lead to more and more extrajudicial killings. These are the concerns which are associated with extrajudicial killings. When you see the ranking of India in terms of democracy index and all these aspects, the extrajudicial killings are one of the big reasons why this happens, right? So human rights violation and reduced faith of global civil society in India's human rights architecture. India, which is conventionally seen as a upholder of human rights, we say Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and we ourselves are not able to help our citizens be free of this malaise called extrajudicial killings. The police is supposed to protect you. The police is not supposed to threaten you, right? If you have not done anything wrong. And in our country, unfortunately, the instant reaction that comes as soon as seeing the police is that of fear. Instead of being protected, it is fear that we feel as soon as we see the police. And that is not something which should be felt. Fine. Then there is, of course, lack of accountability, because the culture there is this concept called overturn window. This concept means, and just look it up, you will understand further, that when you are doing something wrong, you slowly keep on increasing the level of that wrong. And the more you keep increasing it, the more it becomes acceptable to the people, right? So for example, if you are someone who out of 10 times, you will lie at least 3 to 4 times, right? And you have this habit of lying at least 3 to 4 times. So the people around you, the people who you are interacting with, they get used to it. That, this person, you can't really trust this person. So after that, when it is normalized that you are going to lie for 3 to 4 times at least out of 10 times, then if you even lie for 5 to 6 times also, the reaction will not be as strong as against someone who does not lie at all. Are you understanding? If there is someone who is not lying at all, even if he says one lie, there will be very strong reaction against it, that why are you lying? But if there is a person who lies at least 3 to 4 times in 10 times, even if he does 5 to 6 lies, it will be acceptable. And this is called overturn window, right? If we make it a stand that even one extrajudicial killing will be penalized by lifetime prison sentence, then it will be a precedence that okay, I cannot do this. Every police officer will know that I cannot use my gun unnecessarily, otherwise I will be penalized for it. And this happens mostly in the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 cities where accountability is less. So accountability reduces because our overturn window when it comes to our this extrajudicial killings, it keeps on increasing, right? Then it also encourages violence. It is very clear that it keeps on encouraging violence, and it leads to loss of public confidence in the justice system. And as I told you regarding the Hyderabad veterinarian case, that people think that police will be able to tackle it better and police should be tackling it rather than the judicial authorities. Possibility of erroneous convictions like the Mon killings. Armed forces straight away accepting that their judgment was faulty, and the Mon victims, they were actually victims, they were not insurgents. Then they damage the reputation of law enforcement, and it also leads to a retaliation risk. Like when you do one extrajudicial killing, when the system does one extrajudicial killing, and in fact it is always the system, even if it is one officer only that is doing it, it is the system which will be impacted because of it. So retaliation risk increases. The insurgents, the people who are not satisfied with the system, they can further retaliate, and ultimately extrajudicial killing is just a shortcut. Extrajudicial killing is just a shortcut, nothing else. It is just a shortcut to create a mirage of justice, wherein justice is not being served. It is just some superficial form of justice this is being served, right? That is there. Now, this is the deciding part of your answer. You have to mention some of these guidelines which the Supreme Court of India has given. And Supreme Court of India has very clearly said, like the Supreme Court of India said, that extrajudicial killings are state sponsored terrorism, right? So similarly, it has given some suggestions also. It has given some suggestions to arrest this problem also. So one is, every tip off has to be recorded. You get, police officers get some kind of intelligence on the basis of which they act. Like the Vikas Dubey case, they got intelligence that he's going from there and we need to chase him down there, etc. So every such intelligence needs to be recorded. This is one thing, so that there can be no there can be no arbitrariness, no personal biases are set off using this power of extrajudicial killings. And because we have the Official Secrets Act functioning, so it is not that if we record these particular tip-offs, it will lead to compromise in our national security or something like that. That will not happen. Okay, so tip-offs has to be recorded. Then FIR is mandatory whenever an extrajudicial killing happens. Whenever such an instance happens, when a police officer has overstepped his or her duty and killed someone, an FIR is mandatory. It is not something that is discretionary. There should be no delay. There has to be a magisterial inquiry. The Human Rights Commission has to be informed. The victims, because as soon as, even if he was a convict and you were taking him, you as a police officer, you were taking him to the jail, right? And you killed him in between. Even then, he transitions from a convict to being a victim, right? Because he was being served by the rule of law, but you actually overstepped your boundary and you punished him in your own regard. So now he's a victim, and it is your responsibility of informing the victim's kin, nearest kin. Independent probe should be there. There should be medical aid given. If the person is alive, then there should be maximum effort to save that particular person. Then cooperation by officers should be there. There has to be report to the court and Human Rights Commission both, and the nearest magistrate. Submission of half yearly report has to be very regular, how many encounters were done. And disciplinary action, this is the most important thing. Disciplinary action can range from merely suspension for a while to transfer to actually jail term also, if the crime is such, because it is a crime, right? It is a crime only. Then there are some guidelines by NHRC which you need to take into account, and you write it into your paper. And please make a note of these. I am telling you, telling them to you right now. If you have the books, great. If you don't have the books, please make a note right now. Don't ask for PDF later, because I've already told you, you either make handwritten notes or you order the books. Fine. So, Justice M.N. Venkatachalaya Commission actually recommended that such cases need to be transferred to an independent commission. Because if they are not transferred to an independent commission, and if there is an internal inquiry by the department, it is against principles of natural justice. Why? Because the people from the same department are actually investigating the person from their own department, so they will be having some kind of bias, right? So this is against principle of natural justice. So either it is straight away transferred to the judiciary, but judiciary of course has pendency, or it is transferred to an independent commission, right? Another thing is that mandatory compensation has to be there. So see how it transforms, how an extrajudicial killing is such a stupid step to take by the executive, because it transforms a convict into a victim to whom the state now has to pay, right? So the entire narrative changes. The person becomes a victim, and the actual victim of the crime that the person committed, it actually gets diluted, right? So that becomes a problem. Then another thing, guidelines by NHRC in 2010, that there has to be a magisterial report within 48 hours. Magisterial report within 48 hours has to be there, and there has to be a second report within 6 months. Sorry, within 3 months. And this report has to make sure that you give the details of post-mortem, how the person died, what was the cause of death, and time of death and everything, so that it can be established that the person was killed as a result of the law enforcement agencies, right? Apart from these are the generic way forward which you can write and which you should write. So within these way forward itself, you have to include the recommendation of the Venkatachalaya Commission, of the NHRC, of the Supreme Court, etc. So the first thing is, we have to reform our police agencies. Their accountability has to be strengthened, training has to be improved, resources and political influences have to be minimized. So the challenges that they have, they transition into way forward. How? By the concrete recommendations that were given by the Venkatachalaya Commission, by the NHRC, by the Supreme Court. Then strengthening international human rights standards. So we have to ratify International Human Rights Commission. So for example, even if we talk about the International Refugee Commission, which we have not yet signed, that actually reduces the credibility of India as a upholder of human rights, and that's why we need to find a way to sign these particular conventions, and our monitoring and reporting mechanisms needs to be strengthened. Because again, because of these aspects, the ranking in democracy index and whatnot is decreasing, and India has always been an upholder of the democratic rights, the human rights, and that needs to be upheld. Then promoting dialogue and reconciliation, engage in dialogue, encourage community participation. And one more, when it comes to the Dinesh Goswami Committee of Police Reforms, he has also talked about community policing, right? That you should not be just following the law when you are seeing the police around you. You should also be following the law as a matter of habit, and you should be knowing that if you don't follow the law, someone or the other around you will inform the authorities, right? Then strengthening the judiciary, the judicial pendency has to reduce their victims, the rights of the victims, the convicts turned victims or the accused turned victims have to be protected, and caste based violence has to be reduced. So I hope you got a sense of why we need to study this topic, why we needed to study this topic. This is very important, can be asked in a 10 marker, can be asked in a 15 marker, and you use this as a pointer to challenges to rule of law, challenges to separation of power, challenges to our police reforms, the issue on police reforms. So, whichever current affair we cover, you have to make sure that you know at the end where to use it in your examination. So, extrajudicial killings, the topic is done from my side. I hope you derived some value out of this lecture. I will see you all in the next one. Thank you for watching.